The Blairsville Area Underground Railroad History Center, in conjunction with the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, would like to present you with this documentary series on Indiana County's involvement with the Underground Railroad during the 1800s. There were many freedom seekers who escaped through Pennsylvania using the Underground Railroad. While many of these stories were never formally recorded, one story of 3 boys who escaped from Virginia to Indiana had lasting national implications based on a court decision made right here in Indiana.
In 1845, a young slave named Charlie Brown was living and working on the Van Meter farm in Hardy County, Virginia. While driving Mrs. Van Meter back from the market, Charlie Brown saw a slave dealer taking away 2 of his friends. Mrs. Van Meter explained to Charlie that the harvest had been poor, and her husband was forced to begin selling off their best servants. Charlie knew that eventually he would be sold off by the family. Like many slaves in the South at this time, Charlie had heard rumors of slaves escaping by using the North Star for navigation towards freedom. Charlie planned to leave before he too could be sold. He met with a group of slaves and made plans to leave in the middle of the night with 6 of his peers. On his way home from one of these meetings, he encountered a stranger whom he thought would try to stop their escape, but they decided to carry on with their plans, and 2 weeks later, the group escaped Hardy County, Virginia. Partway through the journey, 3 members of the group turned back, leaving only 20-year-old Jared Harris, 16-year-old Anthony Hollingsworth, and Charlie Brown. 15 miles into the journey, they were stopped again by the same stranger. At first, they thought they would be captured, but instead, this stranger was a member of John Graff's network on the Underground Railroad.
April 1845, James Moorhead, editor of Indiana's Clarion of Freedom, heard a knock on the door of his newspaper office. Standing on the doorstep to the office was his 12-year-old grandson, Alexander, and Charlie Brown, who was looking for shelter for Jared, Anthony, and himself. Alexander had encountered Charlie minutes earlier near the old cemetery at the academy and knew him to be a runaway slave. James Moorhead, a known abolitionist and conductor on the Underground Railroad, was meeting with Dr. Mitchell and ministers from the Associate Presbyterian Synod. Moorhead immediately took the boys home to feed and shelter them as he organized places for them to stay. Charlie Brown and Jared Harris were moved to the relative safety of Dr. Mitchell's farm along Tulip Creek by members of the Underground Railroad Committee. Dr. Mitchell, a local physician, often used his land as a hideout location for freedom seekers along their journey through Indiana County. At the recommendation of John Graff, Anthony Hollingsworth was moved to James Simpson's farm near Homer City.
While many were anti-slavery in the county, others, including Sheriff David Ralston, were not. Unfortunately, this would not last long, as 2 slave catchers from Hardy County, Virginia, were looking for the escapees from the Van Meter farm. They managed to capture Anthony Hollingsworth while he was staying at the Simpson farm. The slave catchers headed to the Indiana House Hotel, owned by Sheriff Ralston, to meet with Van Meter. As they approached Indiana, word spread quickly of the 2 strangers and their young captive. But by now, a growing crowd was following them, demanding the release of Hollingsworth. Sheriff Ralston sent word to James Moorhead after the capture of Anthony Hollingsworth, in hopes of having him speak to the angry crowd and convince them to avoid using force to release Anthony. The members of the community demanded Anthony's release and threatened to use force, but James Moorhead convinced them to take the case to court instead in hopes of securing Anthony's release.
He that is for us is stronger than they who are against us. Be persuaded. It may be on the morrow we will have to battle for the right. Make your guard lines strong and wait for the morning.
As it was court week, Judge Thomas White heard the case the next morning. Judge White was openly anti-slavery and, secretly, served as a station master on the Underground Railroad, hiding slaves in his home in White's Farm. Local attorney William Banks defended Hollingsworth. In a brilliant legal move, Judge White required written proof of the legality of slavery in Virginia if he was to enforce Van Meter's claim. When Van Meter and his associates could not do so, he ordered Hollingsworth released. In triumph, Dr. Mitchell and Judge White's sons carried Hollingsworth on their shoulders down the street. Later, Anthony was moved back to the Mitchell farm. For the rest of the summer, Brown, Hollingsworth, and Harris lived openly at Mitchell's farm, hosting visitors and telling of their lives under enslavement. Their stories helped further the anti-slavery sentiment in the area. But Brown wanted to bring Dinah, the woman he loved, and his mother to freedom as well. Dr. Mitchell and Alex Moorhead tried to dissuade him, but sometime in August 1845, Charlie headed south.
In Maryland, Charlie was captured and returned to the Van Meter farm. He was chained in the attic, but escaped that night before Van Meter could sell him to the slave dealers. His mother rubbed his feet with onions to avoid the dogs, and Charlie headed back to Indiana. The trip had taken a tragic toll on Charlie. John McGuire, a local farmer, and his family cared for Charlie at the Mitchell cabins, but feared he would not survive. September 1845, Charlie Brown, Jared Harris, and Anthony Hollingsworth were staying at the Mitchell cabins along Tulick Creek with two recent arrivals. In the middle of the night, Sheriff Ralston broke into the cabin with 3 deputies and 8 slave catchers. Ralston came at Charlie with a club, but Charlie pulled the club away and was ready to swing at Sheriff Ralston when Charlie was knocked unconscious.
Several of the attackers tried to subdue Jared Harris, but he managed to escape into the darkness and climbed a tree to hide from the raid. Anthony Hollingsworth hid on the roof and watched Charlie and the other 2 freedom seekers get taken away. Hollingsworth hid on Mrs. Chapman's farm until morning. After the raid at Mitchell's cabin, Anthony Hollingsworth fled to the safety of Canada. Charles Slayman, another of the Indiana conductors, delivered a letter to Robert Mitchell in 1852 from Hollingsworth in Ontario. Hollingsworth ran a barber shop and in 1864 had letters published in the Perth Gazetteer confronting a man who was disparaging Negroes. He is last mentioned in the 1871 Ontario census. Jared Harris disappeared from history. Some say he went to Canada, others say to Pittsburgh. Following Anthony's case, Dr. Mitchell was sued by Van Meter and lost a large portion of his farm. Mitchell said,
"I'd do it again if they take every penny I've got."
During the Civil War, Judge Thomas White continued to act as a major figure with the railroad as its efforts shifted to supporting the war effort and helping captured Union soldiers escape. This included his son, Harry White, who was appointed to be a general by President Lincoln, and his son, Dickie, who died from the impact of his imprisonment on the day Lincoln was assassinated. John Graff would continue to serve as a major conductor on the Underground Railroad and be part of the Union Army relief efforts during the Civil War. It is unclear what happened to Charlie Brown. Some say he remained in slavery, and others claimed that he managed to get to Canada. The 1871 Ontario census records a Charles Brown of the approximate age.
Judge White's decision in the courtroom regarding the legality of slavery greatly impacted the growth of anti-slavery sentiment in Indiana County. Many locals continued to help freedom seekers escape on the Underground Railroad. The story of Charlie Brown, Anthony Hollingsworth, and Jared Harris is representative of many of the journeys taken by freedom seekers through Indiana County. And while we have a detailed account of what happened to these three, there are many similar stories that were never recorded in history as people traveled the road to freedom.